CIA Director John Ratcliffe's Moscow mission is no longer a mystery. The Kremlin confirms talks with Russian intelligence officials, while Vladimir Putin was briefed on the contacts. Russia appears to prepare another Burevestnik test, while Kyiv pushes Elon Musk to expand Starlink access for Ukrainian drones operating deeper over Russian territory. Iran keeps the Strait of Hormuz restricted despite negotiations over a temporary navigation corridor. Syria begins absorbing the dissolved SDF into its national military structure. Benjamin Netanyahu launches a direct political attack on Gadi Eisenkot. Germany investigates a drone incident that authorities are treating as part of a growing hybrid threat. Former Armenian President Robert Kocharyan faces a major corruption case. NATO reconnaissance activity intensifies around Kaliningrad and the Baltic region. Nikol Pashinyan moves Armenia closer toward a possible future in the European Union. And in Leaders on X, Erdogan on Turkey's political course, Modi on major infrastructure investments, and Antonio Guterres on autonomous weapons. CIA Director John Ratcliffe made a rare visit to Moscow on August 25th, becoming the highest-ranking U.S. intelligence official to travel to the Russian capital since Donald Trump returned to office. The Kremlin has now confirmed that Ratcliffe held talks with representatives of Russian intelligence services, although he did not meet President Vladimir Putin. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Putin was briefed immediately after the contacts and described intelligence channel communication as a positive process that can continue even during periods of severe tension between the two countries. Ratcliffe arrived aboard a U.S. Air Force C-17 Globemaster III that flew from Joint Base Andrews through Riga before landing at Vnukovo. The aircraft remained in Moscow for about 8 hours before departing again, adding to speculation that the trip involved highly sensitive discussions rather than a routine diplomatic visit. The substance of the talks has not been officially disclosed. Multiple reports have linked the visit to possible discussions over Ukraine, including phased de-escalation measures and limits on strikes against energy and port infrastructure. Separate Iranian sources have also claimed that Washington used Moscow to pass demands to Tehran over the Strait of Hormuz, although that part has not been officially confirmed. Iran and Oman have agreed on the framework for a temporary navigation corridor through the Strait of Hormuz, while Tehran continues to insist that the waterway has not fully reopened. The arrangement includes joint demining, information sharing, and coordinated management of ship movements. Technical teams are expected to continue talks on a more permanent route and the rules governing traffic through the waterway. The agreement does not yet restore normal shipping. Traffic through the strait remains far below pre-war levels, and ship owners are still concerned about renewed attacks, mines, and new restrictions. Iran has blacklisted dozens of tankers accused of violating its navigation rules and links a broader reopening to sanctions relief. Pakistan is simultaneously trying to reopen the diplomatic channel between Washington and Tehran. Army Chief Asim Munir and Interior Minister Mohsen Naqvi held talks with Iranian leaders and said significant progress had been made toward restoring the Islamabad Memorandum between the United States and Iran. Islamabad is presenting itself as an intermediary with direct access to both governments. A second pressure point is China. Washington has so far avoided the most disruptive measures against major Chinese financial institutions involved in trade with Iran. Analysts warn that cutting a large Chinese bank off from the international financial system could damage the fragile U.S.-China trade truce ahead of another possible meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. That limits how far Washington can push Iran's economic isolation without opening a second confrontation with Beijing. Inside Iran, the economic pressure is becoming increasingly visible. Fuel production is running below domestic consumption, filling stations have closed in Tehran and Karaj, and queues are forming as shortages spread. The rial has also weakened sharply, adding pressure on households and businesses already dealing with sanctions and restricted access to foreign currency. Iranian officials are publicly rejecting the idea that Washington can force Tehran into submission. Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Bagai has described the new American pressure campaign as economic coercion. The next test is whether the temporary Hormuz arrangement can become a functioning navigation regime. For now, diplomacy is moving again, but the strait remains restricted, sanctions remain in place, and the broader U.S.-Iran confrontation is unresolved. Russia appears to be preparing another test of the Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile, with specialist telemetry aircraft and an A-50U surveillance plane deployed to Rogachevo airfield on Novaya Zemlya. OSINT analysts say the pattern resembles earlier preparations for Burevestnik trials, although there is still no confirmation that a launch is imminent. The missile is designed around a nuclear propulsion system intended to give it extremely long range. The activity, therefore, also carries a broader strategic message from Moscow. In Kyiv, the political argument over how the war is being managed has become unusually public. Former Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov told Reuters that Ukraine appears to be gradually, slowly losing, and warned that the country has only several months to make decisions capable of changing the trajectory. He blamed the absence of an overall strategy, slow military innovation, corruption, and patronage networks. Fedorov argued that Ukraine still has a path to reverse the situation, pointing to artificial intelligence drones, cheaper missile interceptors, and domestically produced ballistic missiles. Ukraine's presidential office pushed back, saying Fedorov had spoken much more positively while he was still in government, and that the main thing that had changed was his own position. Moscow seized on the dispute. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Fedorov's remarks showed growing political infighting inside Kyiv, and claimed Ukraine's leadership was weakening from within. At the same time, Zelensky says Ukraine has received a small new batch of Patriot interceptors and confirmation of future deliveries of French Crotale air defense systems. Kyiv says current stocks remain insufficient and is pressing partners for additional missiles. Zelensky has also renewed efforts to expand Ukraine's access to Starlink for military operations. Kyiv is seeking permission to use the satellite network on Ukrainian drones operating deeper over Russian territory, potentially at ranges of up to 200 kilometers. SpaceX has not confirmed any change to its current geographic restrictions, but Ukrainian officials say talks with Elon Musk are continuing. Diplomatic activity is also continuing outside the main negotiation channels. Vatican Foreign Policy Chief Paul Richard Gallagher traveled to Moscow for talks with Sergei Lavrov, where he renewed the Holy See's call for an end to the war and serious negotiations. Moscow used the meeting to restate its own conditions for a settlement, while both sides agreed to continue cooperation on humanitarian issues. At the United Nations Security Council, Washington again called for an immediate ceasefire and a return to negotiations, while Moscow rejected an unconditional pause, arguing that it would allow Ukraine to regroup and rearm. Ukraine proposed that any future resolution include a 50-kilometer demilitarized zone on the Russian side of the internationally recognized border. The Syrian Democratic Forces have announced their dissolution after an agreement to integrate their fighters into Syria's national army, marking a major change in the country's security structure. The move ends the SDF's role as an independent armed organization. Its forces controlled large parts of northeastern Syria for years and served as the main U.S.-backed ground partner against Islamic State. Under the new arrangement, personnel, units, and security responsibilities are being transferred into structures controlled by Damascus. The agreement could remove one of the biggest remaining obstacles to restoring centralized authority across Syria. The government is trying to bring armed groups and regional administrations under a single chain of command while rebuilding state institutions. The transition is especially important in the Kurdish-led northeast, where local authorities have maintained their own security forces and political structures. Integration raises questions over command arrangements, local autonomy, and the future administration of territories previously controlled by the SDF. Washington is also affected. The United States relied on the SDF as its main local partner against Islamic State, and the integration will force it to reassess that relationship. Turkey will also be watching closely. Ankara has long regarded the Kurdish military component of the SDF as linked to the PKK, and has repeatedly demanded that its armed structures be dismantled. The next test is implementation, whether former SDF units actually enter a unified Syrian command, how weapons and bases are transferred, and what guarantees are offered to Kurdish communities. If the process holds, Damascus will have taken a major step toward rebuilding a single national military structure. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has launched the sharp political attack on former War Cabinet member Gadi Eisenkot, accusing him of abandoning the government before several major Israeli military operations. In a post on X, Netanyahu said Eisenkot had wanted Israel to raise a white flag and move toward elections before the operation against Hezbollah communications, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah and subsequent Israeli operations against Iran. Those are Netanyahu's claims and political framing rather than an independent assessment of Eisenko's position. The Prime Minister presented the dispute as a contrast between two approaches to the war, arguing that his government continued military operations while Eisenkot favored ending the campaign and returning to domestic politics. Eisenkot, a former military chief who joined the emergency government after the Gaza war began, later left the war cabinet and has become increasingly critical of Netanyahu's leadership. Their dispute is now moving from wartime decision-making into a broader political fight over Israel's future leadership. Netanyahu's message was blunt. Netanyahu did not surrender. Eisenkot surrendered. Netanyahu fought. The Post turns disagreements inside Israel's former wartime coalition into a direct political challenge as the country debates responsibility for the war, military strategy, and who should lead Israel next. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says the government will soon present its findings on the drone attack that disrupted Leipzig/Halle Airport earlier this month, as security services continue investigating what Berlin describes as a growing hybrid threat. Merz said the August 4th incident showed that Germany is increasingly being targeted by hostile operations willing to risk serious damage. German media, citing security sources, have reported a possible Russian intelligence connection, but the government has not formally attributed the attack. The Chancellor said investigators are working intensively with security agencies and that conclusions will be made public once the evidence is sufficient. Until then, Berlin is avoiding an official accusation. The case has become part of a wider debate over the vulnerability of European transport and energy infrastructure to drones, sabotage, and cyber operations. Airports are particularly sensitive because even a small unmanned aircraft can force flight suspensions and trigger large security responses. Merz is using the incident to argue for stronger protection of critical infrastructure and faster coordination between federal and regional authorities. The next step is the government's attribution decision, which could carry consequences for Germany's security policy and relations with Moscow. Whether Berlin names a responsible actor, and what political or security measures would follow. Former Armenian President Robert Kocharyan has been detained as part of a corruption investigation involving alleged abuse of office, bribery, and money laundering during his time in power. Investigators say Kocharyan, his son Sedrak, and several other people are implicated in a case involving state property allegedly transferred to private companies at reduced prices before ultimately benefiting people linked to the former president. Searches were carried out at multiple addresses connected to the family and associated businesses. Prosecutors have asked a court to place Kocharyan and his son in custody while the investigation continues. Kocharyan was taken to hospital after questioning, and a detention ruling had not yet been announced. The case is politically sensitive because Kocharyan remains one of Armenia's most prominent opposition figures and has long maintained close ties with Moscow. His supporters call the case politically motivated, while the government says it concerns alleged corruption rather than his political activity. The next step is the court's decision on pretrial detention and the formal presentation of evidence against Kocharyan and the other defendants. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan says his government intends to move toward a formal application for membership in the European Union, followed later by a nationwide referendum on the country's European course. The announcement would mark another major step in Armenia's gradual political reorientation. Yerevan has already expanded cooperation with the European Union, while relations with Moscow have become increasingly strained over security guarantees and Armenia's role in Russian-led regional structures. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed the move, saying Armenia had chosen a firm course toward Europe and that Ukraine was ready to share its own experience of closer integration with the European Union. The next step is whether Pashinyan's government turns the declaration into a formal application and begins preparations for the referendum. Even a successful vote would not guarantee membership, but it would give Armenia's European turn a direct public mandate. NATO and U.S. military aviation have sharply increased activity around Russia's Kaliningrad region and the Baltic Sea, with reconnaissance, electronic warfare, and airborne early warning aircraft operating near the Russian exclave. One of the most unusual missions involved a U.S. Air Force EA-37B Compass Call electronic warfare aircraft flying alongside an E-3 AWACS and a U.S. Army Artemis reconnaissance plane. Polish officials described the operation as a specialized reconnaissance and electronic warfare package, while NATO said the activity was planned and not a response to one specific incident. British reconnaissance aircraft have also been reported near Kaliningrad and the Suwalki corridor, while Allied patrols over Poland and the Baltic states have become increasingly frequent. The area is strategically sensitive because Kaliningrad hosts Russian Iskander missiles, S-400 air defense systems, and major electronic warfare capabilities. The increased activity comes as Belarus conducts another combat readiness inspection of its armed forces, including exercises close to the Lithuanian border. For NATO, the flights provide intelligence on Russian air defenses and electronic activity, while also testing Allied coordination along one of the alliance's most exposed eastern sectors. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Parliament has approved the new legal framework connected to the government's Turkey Free of Terrorism initiative. The measure passed with 467 votes. Erdogan presented it as part of a wider effort to remove terrorism from the country's political and security agenda, and said Turkey intends to continue pursuing stability both at home and across the region. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi says infrastructure projects worth around 30,000 crore rupees are being launched across 9 states. The package covers railways, roads, and energy projects, with New Delhi presenting the investments as part of a wider drive to improve connectivity, strengthen regional infrastructure, and support economic development. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is calling for international restrictions on autonomous weapon systems. He says machines must never be allowed to make life and death decisions without human control, and is urging governments to establish clear prohibitions and safeguards before the technology becomes more widely deployed.